I'm Leni Wild from the Overseas Development Institute, and I guess as one of the co-conveners of some previous discussions on this theme, I was going to kick off with just giving a bit of a background to this doing development differently sort of idea and some of the connections to some of the other agendas that have already been mentioned by Steve. And briefly just talk you through the sort of structure of today, our agenda, and I guess what we're hoping to get out of the next couple of days. So this idea of doing development differently, I think, is familiar to some of you. I see some familiar faces of those who've taken part in previous meetings, but perhaps less so to others. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of the background. The idea of it is that it's a network that can, I guess, help to facilitate a dynamic conversation amongst practitioners about how we can make development more effective. The sort of primary output of a previous meeting held last year was the Doing Development Differently manifesto that I think you've all been given a copy of as you came in. And I guess that tried to capture the views of a pretty diverse group of practitioners who met in October last year and set out some principles of what we thought more effective development practice could look like. And there'll be a chance for us to reflect a bit on that manifesto later in the day, and also to get some of your views from those of you who are sort of now joining this broader group. But why do I think these themes matter? To me, this year, 2015, is an interesting one, as we've got the end of the Millennium Development Goals and a discussion about a new global framework, and a lot of reviews happening of progress thus far. And it seems to me that some of the big development gaps that we face now are themselves complex, they're sort of adaptive, they're changing, they're often politically challenging, and that grappling with those requires some different approaches. So, for example, I work a lot on service delivery. If we look at education, we know that globally there's been real progress in getting children into school, partly by financing school construction, big enrollment drives. But the big challenge now is ensuring that they're learning as a result of that. And that's a much harder thing to achieve. It's more complex. There's no one thing that you do. You've got to bring lots of things together. It requires changes in behavior, incentives of different actors, whether that's teacher motivation, it's school management, it's getting parents involved, it's getting learners involved in the process. So it requires a sort of different set of inputs. It's not just about financing. If we look at, say, water and sanitation, again, we know globally good progress on access to clean water. So the Millennium Development Goal target around access to drinking water was achieved 5 years early. But sanitation really lags behind. Again, it's a much more complex reform area that requires many things to come together, changes in behavior, sort of different incentives of different actors, social norms, and more. And I think there are many more examples from a whole range of different sectors that you'll all be aware of as well. So I guess what initially brought this network together was people coming from different backgrounds, approaches. We use different language to describe what we do, but who all shared a kind of frustration with the lack of progress in some areas. And I guess this is not to say that the idea of doing development differently necessarily applies to everyone and everything, right? There might well be a place around some issues for international best practice, for more rigid project structures. But what we're saying is where there are these kind of chronic development gaps, which are complex, where you have to change incentives, where you don't really know what the one solution is, then a different approach is needed, and that's what we're interested in reflecting upon. So I guess as I said, we initially brought together a group who are coming from different countries, who'd been working on different kinds of programs at different levels with different kind of actors in country. But we put together this manifesto that tried to set out a set of principles for what different approaches seem to look like. What do they share across this kind of diverse experience? And they are there. Hopefully you've got a copy in front of you, but I'll just briefly run through some of the main elements of that. So the first is this idea of being problem-driven, so not coming in with a set of ready-made solutions, but trying to foster and support people to solve problems for themselves. And that's those who are impacted by whatever problem you're dealing with, but also those who can do something about it. So it's getting a kind of coalition of people together. That needs a sort of authorizing environment. It needs to be legitimated at different levels, whether that's social, political, managerial. It often works through local conveners, brokers, facilitators, those who bring together all of those who have a stake in progress, whether that's formally or informally. I think we're going to be hearing from some of those kind of conveners over the next couple of days as well. There's a big emphasis here on what I'd call sort of stepwise processes or learning. So rather than sort of pre-designed, pre-planned interventions, you recognize that that design and implementation has to go alongside each other. You've got a kind of learning by doing approach where the outcomes are uncertain. So it often requires very rapid sort of feedback loops so that you're learning about what works and what doesn't as you go and adjusting and adapting. This is a sort of often linked to a more entrepreneurial approach. Again, we'll hear more about that from some of our speakers later. But the idea is rather than putting all your investment in one solution, your sort of big bet, that you try and spread that. You make small bets as part of that testing and trialing. And finally, something that we all thought was really important was that ultimately this is about results. It's about delivering tangible improvements for people, and that has to be a sort of core element of whatever we're talking about. Now, we were initially a small group, about the same size as we are meeting here today. We put the manifesto online, and I think what's interesting is that it's been signed up to by sort of hundreds of people in about 60 different countries. And that's some within donor agencies, but it's people within line ministries, within NGOs, within the private sector, a whole range of different organizations and people sort of signing up to it. And I think it does feel like it's sort of tapping into a bit of a moment for some of these discussions, including with some internal reform processes happening within different donor agencies and other development organizations as well. So I'm really excited to be here in Manila to sort of extend the conversation further. And I guess a key aim that we were hoping to sort of facilitate through this workshop was, as Steve said, to bring the discussion sort of further down to some of the implementers. And many of you in this room have been involved in either supporting or delivering programs to work in this way, and we're excited to sort of hear from you. So I guess one key aim is to continue in our tradition of sharing some of the practical experiences and lessons of how to do programs in this way. We recognize that what we're talking about here is not new. There's a very long history of efforts of trying out different approaches and sort of learning. And I guess we don't have all the answers yet either. So I think what's key is that we can share some of those different country experiences, program lessons. We can see what some of the similarities are across them, what some of the differences are, and continue to sort of build up a repository of knowledge, of lessons, of experience that can, I think, hopefully help us all going forwards. So that's definitely a key aim. And there'll be a number of presentations that you'll hear over the next couple of days of examples of work, and they'll be recorded by our cameraman at the back and shared online afterwards. And we have a library on our Doing Development Differently website that I would also encourage you to check out. I guess another key aim of the workshop is that we do want to give some space to reflect on some of the challenges, the constraints, the issues that you all might be grappling with in trying to work in this way. And Steve's again highlighted a few of these already. I think we'll all have our own views about what they are, and we've tried to build in a number of sort of more open sessions in the agenda that will give us space to raise our issues and hopefully find groups of like-minded people who are struggling with some of the same challenges. From my perspective, there's a couple that I hope we'll kind of get to over the next couple of days. The first is that I think at the moment what we've got is a set of very broad principles. And they all sound great, right? Everyone can say they're flexible, they're problem-driven, sort of who would deny some of that? But we know, and I know from discussions that I've been having in different parts of the world on these issues, that there may be instances where organizations, groups are signing up to principles but not necessarily delivering on those in practice, or there's a bit of a gap in terms of the realities of what people are doing on the ground. So I think I'm interested to hear reflections about whether we need to better define or maybe set better benchmarks about some of what we're talking about, so to be clear about what counts and what doesn't here. I guess a second issue is that I think there's still pretty strong tendency for people to dismiss more adaptive, more learning approaches as not compatible with a results agenda and with some of the accountability pressures that different development organizations face. And I recognize that's an issue, but I don't think, I think this agenda won't get very far if we sort of accept defeat on that front. It seems to me that if we're serious about working in this way, we should be taking results even more seriously. There may be some ways we want to change how some of that agenda plays out in different agencies, but it feels like it would be great if we could start to share more examples of monitoring and results frameworks that both serve the needs of implementers to learn and adapt as they go, but also allow us to meet the accountability pressures that agencies face. And I think there is a space of overlap there, and that's what I hope we can sort of share ideas on. And I guess my third area that I'm interested to explore is that I think I still pick up a tendency to describe this agenda or to see it as something which perhaps remains on the margins of development practice. So perhaps, yeah, okay, we get that this is an interesting approach, but it can be seen as being relevant for a subset of governance programs or accountability programs. Whereas my starting point is those complex, sort of chronic development gaps that we know face, and the extent to which they reinforce the need for different approaches. And I think if we start there, it potentially opens up to a much wider range of programming across different sectors. And I think we'll have opportunities to hear over the next couple of days from those who have been working in a range of different sectors, both sort of social sectors, more productive sectors, and it will be interesting to hear about that and share experience. So those are a few reflections. Very much looking forward to hearing all of your contributions. Just to give you a brief, you've got the agenda in your pack as you came in, but just to give you a very brief overview of how we've tried to structure the next couple of days. We have built in a number of sessions where people will be talking about their practical experience. And from this, we'll move straight into a session hosted by Jaime Faustino, reflecting on some of the Asia Foundation's work with partners here in the Philippines. And I think it will be a really interesting opportunity for us to hear a bit about what Jaime calls the ecosystem, the networks and the connections around sort of reform agendas and how they happen and how they're made. Following that, we'll have a short opportunity for you to grab coffee, stretch your legs, and then we'll go straight into an open space discussion, where the idea, as I said, is very much for people to suggest the ideas and the issues, the burning issues that you have on this agenda that you'd like to discuss, and we'll form groups around those. Some of you have sent those in already, so we can work off those, but others in the room, I'd say, think as you're listening this morning as to what your questions are and bring them out in that session. We'll break for lunch, and lunch will be at the Basics restaurant, which is on the ground floor to the right. We can direct you down there. And this afternoon, we'll have two more sort of practical sessions, one reflecting on the experience of Phyo Phin in Myanmar, and one reflecting on a large empowerment and accountability program, VEEP, in Vietnam. And then we'll have a final session at the end of the day, which will give us a chance to reflect and get your feedback on the manifesto. But we're hoping that this will be a session where those who've signed that manifesto can maybe share what they've been doing to put some of those principles into practice. Those who haven't yet, perhaps are new to it can give their feedback, their reflections, but also perhaps raise some of the questions or the challenges that they see, which can help feed into the next day's discussion as well. And tomorrow we'll have sessions that look particularly on the financing and the funding angles, so with a number of donor representatives. We'll have more practical sort of experience sharing, and we'll have more of the open space discussions and chance for you to input into those. So thank you very much. We're hoping it's a pretty active participation session, so lots of opportunities for questions, comments, feedback as we go. So please do join in the discussion.